Half frozen, a widow bartered her late husband's boots. The cobbler wed her. The boots came through my door on a Tuesday, which I remember because I only got one customer on Tuesdays as a rule, and that was Denton the freighter, and he always smelled like mule and never said much beyond pointing at what needed fixing. So when the door opened and it wasn't Denton, I looked up. She was carrying the boots in both arms, pressed against her chest like you'd carry firewood. Brown leather, men's, a size 11 at least. She was maybe 5'3". The boots were almost as long as her forearm. She said, "I don't have money." I said, "Most people don't." That was the truth of Harlan, Kansas in the winter of 1873. She set the boots on my counter and I looked at them. Good boots. Somebody had cared about them once. The stitching on the left one had started to pull at the toe box, and the heel on the right had worn down to nearly nothing. But the leather was sound, the uppers were intact, and whoever had made them had known what they were doing. She said, "I need women's boots. Size 6 if you have them. I'm told you sometimes have stock." I had stock. I kept a small inventory, not much, 6 or 8 pairs usually, because in a town like Harlan there wasn't always time to custom make, and people needed things now, not in 3 weeks. I had 2 pairs in women's sizes. One was a black dress boot with a stacked heel that had been sitting there since the spring, and one was a plain brown work boot. Nothing fancy, but solid and warm and the right kind of thing for a Kansas winter. She said, "Those will do," pointing at the work boots. I said, "What do you want for the men's pair?" She said, "A trade, straight across if you'll take it." The boots she'd brought in were worth more than the ones she wanted. Anybody could see that. I picked up the man's pair and turned them over and looked at the sole and pressed my thumb into the leather at the ankle and felt it give the right way. I said, "Where'd these come from?" She didn't flinch. She said they were my husband's. He died in October. I've been using them to walk in because mine gave out in November, and I've been stuffing the toes with rags to keep them on, but I can't go on like that. She said it plain, no performance to it. I said, "I'll take the trade." She said, "Do you need to know my name for the ledger?" I said, "Only if you want to be in the ledger." She said, "Margaret Voss." She spelled the last name out, which not everyone did. I wrote it down. She pulled on the work boots right there at the counter, laced them herself, working the laces careful and deliberate, pulling each cross tight before she went to the next. When she was done, she stood up and pressed her feet against the floor and shifted her weight once, just testing them. She said, "Thank you," and she left. I stood there looking at the man's boots on my counter for a while after that. The thing about being a cobbler is that people hand you the most personal objects they own and then walk away. A man's boot tells you a great deal. The way the sole wears tells you how he walks. Do his heels strike hard or do his feet roll in or out? Does he favor one side? The places where the leather creases tells you where his foot is widest, what he does with his toes when he's standing still. The inside of a boot after years of use has the ghost of the foot that wore it. You can almost see the man. The boots Margaret Voss had brought in told me that her husband had been a careful man. The sole wear was even, heel to ball, no dragging, no supination. He'd walk straight and steady. The laces had been replaced at some point, different weight than original, and whoever had replaced them had put in a longer set than needed and doubled them back through the top eyelets to take up the slack. Practical. The left boot had a small repair near the ball of the foot, stitching from the inside, and it had been done with a curved needle and the same wax thread I used myself. Either he'd fixed it himself, or he'd taken it to a man who knew what he was doing. I put them on my bench and thought about them for a few days before I worked on them. I'm not sure why. Eventually, I replaced the heel on the right, restitched the toe box on the left, and cleaned and dressed the leather with neat's foot oil. Then I put them in the window with a price on a slip of paper tucked inside. A man came in 2 weeks later and bought them. He didn't ask where they'd come from. Most people don't ask. I'd come to Harlan 3 years before from Ohio, which is not the kind of place people come from in stories like this. Ohio. I had a shop there in a town called Granville, a good shop, built it myself with my father's tools and what he'd left me, and I ran it for 9 years. I was good at the work. My father had been good at it and his father before him. And you can say a lot about inheriting a trade, but the thing nobody says is that when you've been shown something right from the beginning, from the very first time you hold a lasted shoe and understand how the upper is pulled over the form and the welt is attached and the sole is sewn through, when you've had that shown to you by someone who loved it, you carry that. It goes into your hands. You don't even have to think about it after a while. I left Ohio because I left Ohio. There are things I won't go into. My wife had died in '69, fever, and after that the shop felt smaller and the town felt smaller, and some mornings I woke up and could not think of a reason to open the front door. Not because I was ruined exactly. More like the bearings had come loose, and I needed to go somewhere where nobody knew what I'd been before. Granville was full of men who thought they knew me. Some of them were right, and that was the problem. Kansas was far enough. Harlan was a nothing town in the middle of a nothing county, which suited me. I rented a building on the main street and put up a sign and started. The first year was lean. The second year I started to know people's feet, which is really the same as starting to know people in this trade, and by the third year I was doing all right. Not prosperous, all right. I had a room in the back of the shop with a stove and a cot and a window that faced west. And in the evenings after I locked up, I sat at that window and watched the light go. I was 41 years old and I was not unhappy, but I was alone in the way a man gets alone when he's been alone long enough that he stopped calling it anything. Margaret Voss came back in February. The winter had been bad, 3 storms in 6 weeks, the second one genuinely dangerous, the kind of cold that comes off the plains like a wall and doesn't move for days. The town had gone quiet in the way towns go quiet when people are trying not to die. I'd spent most of January and half of February working by lamplight because the windows were iced over, which was fine. I didn't need to see out. She came in on a day when it had finally turned. Not warm, but not deadly. The kind of February day in Kansas where the sun actually comes through, and the light on the snow is almost white, almost bearable. She wanted her boot repaired. The left one, the work boot I'd traded her. The seam at the heel counter had started to open. She said it had been doing it since about Christmas, and she'd been ignoring it, but now it was letting in cold. I told her to sit down and I'd look at it. She sat on the bench by the window. I crouched down and she pulled the boot off and handed it to me. Her sock had a hole in the heel, and when she saw that I'd noticed it, she tucked her foot back under the bench. I didn't say anything about it. I looked at the boot. The seam had opened maybe an inch, not terrible but not good. I could fix it in 20 minutes. I said, I'll have it done before you have to leave. She said, I don't have anywhere to be. I went to my bench and she sat there and we were quiet for a while. The light was coming through the cleared part of the window. I'd scraped a pane-sized circle in the frost that morning, and it lay in a stripe across the floor. She said, Are you from here originally? I said, Ohio. She said, I wouldn't have guessed that. I said, What would you have guessed? She thought about it. She said, Somewhere with more quiet. I wasn't sure what that meant exactly, but I didn't ask. I was working the seam, pressing the welt back against the counter, getting the awl started for the stitching. She said, I'm from Illinois. My husband and I came out in '69. He had the idea that there was land to be had. There was land, he wasn't wrong about that. It just turned out to be harder than the idea of it. I said, That's usually how it goes. She said he wasn't a complainer, though. I want to be fair to him. He worked hard and he didn't complain. He just ran out of time. I didn't say I was sorry. I hate when people say that. I always have. It's true and it means nothing. I finished the stitching and ran my thumb along it and it was sound. I said, What happened to him? She said, Fever, same as half the county that October. He went fast at least, a week from sick to gone. I set down the boot. I looked at her. She was looking at the stripe of light on the floor. Her hands were in her lap and she was sitting straight, the way women who have been working hard sit, like their backs have forgotten there's any other option. She had dark hair with some gray at the temples, more than you'd expect for a woman who looked as young as she did in the face. Her jaw was set but not against me, just set. I said I lost a wife too, Ohio, 69. She looked at me then. She said the same year. I said, seems like that year had a lot to answer for. She made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. She picked up the boot from the bench beside her where I'd set it and turned it over and looked at the sole. She said, "This is good work." I said, "I learned from my father." She said, "It shows." There was something in the way she said it that wasn't flattery. It was just an observation. She had the quality of saying what she meant without wanting anything back for it, and that was not common. I had known plenty of people in my life who gave compliments like they were making investments. She wasn't doing that. I said, "No charge for the repair." She said, "I'll pay." I said, "The trade we made in December more than covered this." She looked at me for a moment. Then she put on the boot and laced it up the same way she had before, careful, each cross pulled tight. She stood up and said thank you and walked to the door. At the door she stopped and didn't turn around. She said, "I make a good rabbit stew. If you wanted, I could bring some." I said I wouldn't turn down rabbit stew. She left. She brought it the following Saturday. A covered pot held in both hands, knocking at the door with her elbow because her hands were full. It was cold enough that the steam was rising off the lid. She came in and set it on my work bench, the far end, the clean end, and said, "I brought bread too. It's in my coat pocket." She pulled it out. It was wrapped in a cloth and still a little warm. I had a table and 2 chairs in the back room where I ate, and I cleared the chairs of what was on them. One had a last on it that I'd forgotten to put away. One had my father's old leather apron draped over it. I'd been meaning to repair a buckle on the strap for 6 months, and I set 2 plates. I didn't have much for plates, 2 that matched and 1 that didn't. I put the matching ones out. We ate the stew. It was good. I said so. She said, "It's just rabbit and turnips." I said, "The turnips are good. A lot of people cook the hell out of turnips and lose them." She said, "My mother always said that, about not cooking the hell out of them." She said it plain like that, the hell, which I hadn't expected from a woman who'd seemed careful in her speech, and I think that pleased me more than anything she might have said otherwise. We talked through the meal, not about anything important. The roads. A family named Gerber who'd come through town that week and whether they were going north or staying. The price of coal, which was getting bad. There was a naturalness to it. I'd eaten with people, in my Ohio years, plenty of people. A shop in a small town means you know everyone, and people are always feeding you. But there was always a social machinery running in those meals, the way you're performing for each other in a town where everyone is watching everyone. This didn't feel like that. It felt like 2 people who'd each been alone long enough to have dropped all the gear that loneliness makes you carry, and were just sitting there without it. She washed the plates when we were done. I told her not to, she did it anyway. She dried her hands on the cloth that had wrapped the bread, because I didn't have a proper kitchen towel, which I felt embarrassed about in a vague way for about 3 seconds, and then stopped feeling embarrassed about because she didn't seem to care. When she put on her coat to go, she said, "I'll bring the pot back for another one in a few weeks." I said, "I'll look forward to it." The weeks after that are not something I can separate cleanly in my memory. Things don't arrange themselves into a clear before and after. What I remember is a series of images, more than a sequence. The pot came back on a Saturday 4 weeks later. Venison that time, with dried onions. The bread was different, sweeter. She put something in it I couldn't identify, and when I asked she said molasses and laughed because I should have been able to taste it. I couldn't tell you when that stopped being the first Saturday of the month and started being every Saturday. I can't tell you exactly when I started leaving the back room cleaner on Friday evenings, washing the table, checking that the 2 matching plates were on the shelf. I just know that I did. Her place was 3 miles out of town. She'd wintered there alone after her husband died, which was a thing most people considered either brave or stupid depending on how they felt about her. And I knew which most of the town was leaning toward because, in a town like Harlan, there is always someone who thinks a widow alone on a claim is a resource to be argued over, and there were at least 2 men who'd made known their interest in that resource. She discouraged them both without drama and without apology, which was all she'd say about it. I rode out there once in March, when she hadn't come on the usual Saturday. The road was bad after a week of freeze-thaw, and I'd thought she might not have been able to get through, but I went anyway. Her claim was a quarter section, a small house and a barn and a pump in the yard. The pump handle was tied with a strip of cloth to keep it from freezing down. She was in the yard when I rode up, splitting wood. She stopped when she saw me and stood there with the axe in her hand. She said I couldn't get through. I said I thought as much. She said you didn't have to ride out. I said I wanted to see that you were all right. She looked at me for a moment. Then she said, I'm all right. Come inside, I'll put coffee on. She leaned the axe against the woodpile and we went in. The house was small and cold and clean, and she moved around it without any waste, lighting the stove, finding the cups, doing 2 things at once the way people do when they've been managing alone for a long time and gotten good at it. She'd put up shelves herself. I could see they'd been put up by an amateur, but they were solid. She'd used enough nails. There was a pair of her husband's boots by the door, not the ones she'd traded me, a different pair, older, and they were set side by side neat as anything. She handed me the coffee. I took it. She had a bruise on the back of her hand that she hadn't had before, dark yellow-green, a few days old. I said, what happened to your hand? She looked at it like she'd forgotten it was there. She said, pump handle slipped. I was working on the freeze. I said, you should have someone help you with that. She said, I don't have someone. I said you could ask. She looked at me over the rim of her cup. She said, I'm asking now. I fixed the pump. It took about an hour. The packing had compressed and the valve seat was fouled, and it needed a new leather cup, which I didn't have on me, but I had a piece of harness leather in my saddlebag that I could cut down, and I did that. By the time I was done, my hands were numb to the wrist, and she'd come out and stood near me the way people do when they want to help but know they can't. When the pump worked, she tried it twice. The water ran clear. She said, thank you, in the voice she used when she meant it more than one word could hold. On the way home, I thought about things. Mostly I thought about the sound of the pump working again and the way she'd stood there in the cold watching me fix it. There are men who are praised for dramatic things. Things in public, things with an audience. In my life, nobody had ever put me in front of an audience, and I didn't want one. What I wanted was what I'd felt standing at that pump with my hands numb and the water running clear, and a woman standing in the cold of her own yard watching me fix what was broken. That was the thing. That was exactly the thing. In April, I asked her to walk with me. That was all I said. I asked if she'd walk with me after the Saturday meal. She said yes. We walked the length of the main street and back and said very little, and when we turned back toward the shop, she put her hand in the crook of my arm and left it there. The street was empty. The light was going. Her hand was in my arm, and we walked to the end of the block, and I stopped and she stopped, and we stood there for a moment, and I could feel the weight of her hand on my arm. I put my other hand over hers, just for a moment. Then I took it away. I said, I want to say something to you, and I want to say it plain, because I've been sitting with it a while. She said, all right. I said, I'm 42 years old and I run a cobbler's shop in a town nobody writes home about, and I have a room in the back with 1 window and 2 matching plates. I'm not a man people in this town take much account of. I'm not sure I've been a man people took account of anywhere I've been, but I've been watching you since December, and you're the clearest person I've come across in a long time. You know what things are worth. You see what's real and what isn't, and I think you may see me. I don't know if I'm wrong about that. She was quiet for a moment. The street was entirely empty, and the light was the last low light before dark, coming in flat and gold from the west. She said, "You're not wrong about it." I said, "Then I'd like you to know that whatever you want from your life from here, I'd like to be in it if you'll have me. I'm not asking for anything that isn't yours to give. I just want you to know where I stand." She looked at me straight. She had that quality of looking at things straight that you find in people who have been through real things, not hard, not cold, but clear. She said, "I told myself in October when everything was gone at once that I was done making plans, that I'd take what came and not expect more than what was real." She paused. She said, "You're real, Tom." Nobody had said my name to me like that in a long time. Not like a greeting, not like a name on a bill. Like it was the word for the thing itself. Like she'd been thinking about which word to use, and that was the one. I said, "Then I'm going to court you if you'll allow it, properly. We'll take whatever time you need." She said, "I don't need a great deal of time. I'm not a young woman and I know my own mind." She said it without apology, and something in me went quiet. The specific quiet of a man who has spent a long time wondering if he was worth the trouble. I spent most of May thinking about my shop and what I had and what I could offer. I had the building, which I was renting, but I'd spoken to the owner and there was a possibility of purchase. I had my tools, which were good, my father's set supplemented with what I'd bought over the years. I had a reputation for solid work, which in a trade like mine is the whole of it. I had no debts. I had enough. I kept adding it up and kept coming out at enough. On the first Saturday in June, she came in with her pot as usual, and after we ate she stayed later than she usually did, and we sat in the back room with the window open to the warm evening, and she talked about the claim. She said she thought she might sell it. She said her husband had held onto it hard because it had been his dream more than hers, and she'd honored that. But now she thought there was a time to let go of a thing that had been someone else's. I said, "What would you want if it weren't the claim?" She thought about it. She said, "Something solid, something that wasn't always one bad season from nothing." I said, "The shop's solid." She looked at me. I said, "I'm not saying it as a sales proposition. I'm saying it as a fact because you asked what I had to offer, or near enough." She said, "I didn't ask that." I said, "You were about to." She made that sound again, the almost laugh. She said, "Maybe." I said, "Margaret, I'd like you to marry me. I know you said you know your own mind, and I know that hasn't changed. I'm not asking from doubt. I'm asking because every week since December I've been more certain of the same thing, and it seems wasteful to wait anymore." She was quiet for a long moment, long enough that I sat there and did not try to fill it. The window was open and it was warm, and somewhere down the street a dog was barking at something and the sound faded. She said, "I brought these boots in here in December not knowing what I was walking into. I had the boots, and I needed what I needed, and that was the whole of my plan." I said, "How's the plan looking now?" She said, "Different than I expected, better." I said, "Is that a yes?" She said, "That's a yes, Tom." We were married in July, a Tuesday, because Tuesdays were quiet and neither of us wanted a fuss. The judge from the county seat had been in town for something else and agreed to do it after his other business was done. 2 witnesses, the woman who ran the dry goods, who'd always been decent to me, and a man named Aldrich who'd been my customer since I'd arrived and who came to everything in town because he said he liked to see what people did when they thought it mattered. It was quick. We said what needed to be said in front of the judge and signed the paper, and that was the thing. Margaret wore a gray dress that was not a wedding dress, and she pinned her hair up, and there was a piece of dark blue ribbon in it that I don't know where she found. Her boots were the work boots I'd traded her in December, which I'd resoled in June without telling her and slipped back under the bench when she wasn't looking. She'd noticed but not said anything. When she'd looked at them, she'd made the face of someone who's been seen to and said nothing, and that had been enough. After the judge and the witnesses were gone, we walked back to the shop. The town was going about its business. Nobody was watching us in particular, or if they were, I didn't care. She was carrying her hat in her hand. She'd taken it off after the ceremony. I don't know why, I didn't ask. We went in through the front and I locked the door and turned the sign. She looked around the shop. She'd been in it 100 times by then, but she looked at it like she was looking at it fresh. The benches, the tools, the peg board, the last rack, the small inventory of stock. She walked slowly along the wall and touched the edge of the workbench with 2 fingers, the grain of it, the smooth, worn place where I put my elbows. She said, "Where do you want to put my things?" I said, "Wherever you want them." She said, "That's not an answer." I said, "Whatever space you need, it's yours. All of it if you want. We'll figure out what goes where." She came back to where I was standing by the counter. She was close. She put her hand flat on my chest, just for a moment, and looked at me the way she'd looked at me on the street in April, straight and clear and without anything in the way of it. She said, "I see you, Tom. I want you to know that. I see what you are." I put my hand over hers. Her hand was warm and I held it there. I don't know how to say what that was like, except that it was the first time in a long time I believed it, that I was worth seeing. Not because she said so, exactly, though she had said so, but because she was a woman who didn't give away things she didn't mean, and she'd been through enough of the real world to know the difference between a man who was real and a man who was just standing there. She knew, and she'd chosen this. I'm going to tell you what the rest of it looked like, because you should know. She sold the claim in the fall for a fair price, and we put it into buying the building outright. That took everything and then some. I had to take a loan from the bank, which I cleared in 2 years. She took over the bookkeeping, which turned out to be considerably better than my bookkeeping, which is not saying much. She had a clear head for numbers and she didn't let anything slide, and inside of a year, the shop was running more tightly than it had ever run when it was just me. She put up shelves in the back room, proper ones this time, level and well anchored, and they had books on them and jars and things I hadn't known I was missing until they were there. She took down the cot and brought a proper bed. She put curtains on the window that faced west, and in the evenings when the light came through, they were a dark gold, like the kind of light that comes the hour before sunset in September, that low particular gold you get on the plains. The town took its time deciding what to think. That's the nature of small towns. There were people who decided I was a confirmed bachelor and felt obscurely annoyed by me not having consulted them. There were people who thought Margaret could have done better, which she let go past her without any visible effect because she'd never asked the town's opinion and wasn't about to start. By the 2nd year, none of it mattered much. You outlast what people say by just going on. She is a good woman. I don't mean it as a praise, not exactly. I mean it as a fact, the kind of fact you keep arriving at. She is stubborn and she doesn't stop working when she should rest, and she has strong opinions about the order things should be done in, and she makes me eat when I forget to eat. She told me once near the beginning that she thought most people went through life looking right past the useful things in front of them. I think she meant the claim, her husband's plan, the way that plan had looked past what was already there. But I've thought about it since, about what it means to see what's right in front of you, to recognize the weight and quality of a thing instead of only looking at what it isn't. She recognized me, a man in a back room with a west-facing window and 2 matching plates. She walked in with her husband's boots pressed against her chest, and she recognized me before either of us knew that was what was happening. I've thought about that a lot over the years. On a cold morning when the light comes through the curtains and she's already got the stove going and I can hear her moving in the other room. On a night when she's reading at the table and I'm working at the bench and the lamp between us is burning low and neither of us has said anything in an hour, and it doesn't need anything said. I think about those boots on my counter in December, and I think about the way she laced them up that first time. Careful, even, each cross pulled tight. She'd come in half frozen carrying the last of her husband, and she'd walked out in good boots and she'd come back. That's the whole of it, A woman came in with a trade. It was a fair trade, better than fair once the full accounting came in. The boots sat in my window for 2 weeks, and a man bought them in January who didn't ask where they'd come from. I used the money to buy leather. I still have the last. I made her first pair of custom boots, 18 months after the wedding, her Christmas present, black leather with a low heel and extra depth through the toe box for the way her foot was shaped. The last hangs on a peg by my bench. I don't know why I've kept it. Maybe because it's the shape of her foot in wood, and a man likes to have the shape of what he values, somewhere in reach. The curtains are still there. The light still comes through them gold in September, the hour before it's gone.